Hello everyone, we are today at the Tank Museum at Bovington and here's the curator David Willey. And the question is, do you think different countries have different tank philosophies, and specifically if they have, what do you think about the Russian or Soviet tank philosophy? So basically from Second World War onwards to basically nowadays.
Well, how can I put this politely? It's not the sort of thing I go around sort of humming to myself about, that Russian tank philosophy, isn't it a fun thing to be discussing on a very hot afternoon? But yes, absolutely, it is worth thinking about, because I always use this word sometimes, whether you use the word philosophy, doctrine, another really interesting word. What does a country, how does it think it's going to fight? And therefore, what's the equipment it's going to need to do it? And because back to us tendency to top Trump's way of judging bits of kit, but what was it intended for? How is it going to be used? And how did we think, or how did that country at the time think it was going to be used that way in future warfare, or the wars they thought were coming? And how adaptable, which is the other key thing, that kit is, because no country can predict the future. So we've all got to have plans. We all need doctrine to train the soldiers. This is how we think it's going to be. But when warfare comes, the old Mike Tyson quote, everyone has a plan till they're hit in the mouth, So that idea, then suddenly it all comes apart. But can we readapt? Can we change our doctrine? Can we use the equipment in a more effective or different manner to what the situation is? Now, for the Russians, the really weird one about tanks is, nobody's really building tanks in numbers in the 20s and 30s, okay? We've had the experiment in World War I, Western Allies, Britain, France, America, just at the end, starting to see the benefit, but it's really infancy. Everyone knows in the 20s and 30s the tank is going to have a role, mechanization as a whole, but the nature of the fighting that goes on, Spanish Civil War, some smaller wars where armoured vehicles are being used, Britain policing an empire, what can we do with some of these things? Use of air power, etc. There's a lot going on that it's not necessarily giving firm answers or a clear direction. And you pick your war, you can take out of it what you think is going to benefit you. And so this idea of experimentation, but also lack of money. Don't forget 29, Great Depression, 1930, everyone sort of, there's no money around to do all these things. The one country that bucks all that is Russia. And the Soviet Union is the one country that basically Stalin is saying, look, we are going to use tank production as part of our 5-year plans. Tukhachevsky, the Russian theorist general, is coming along with, we are a country, we can face up to the future in different ways. One of which is we can mechanize, we can industrialize, we can build an armored force and use the nature of our territory, which is enormous, for the idea of what we now know of as deep battle. In other words, we have mass formations, we can use territory in this manner. That surely is a way we can go and change our tack from what was a previous theories of the White Armies, the Tsarist armies, etc. So that argument, and he wins that debate with Stalin. So parts of, the Soviet Union are starting to build in the 1930s tanks in numbers that just dwarfs the rest of the world added up. So America, 300 tanks built plus by 1939. They're experimenting with ideas. Britain, we have a modest tank fleet. Germany, just starting the ideas, working with the Russians out in Kazan. That type of thing going on. But in terms of sheer numbers, you just look at one model, something like the T-16 or T-26 rather, for the Russians there, 1930, they're importing a British export 6-tonner and then building it under license, putting a different turret on the top. Tens of thousands, these are staggering figures. No one's doing that. So that idea of they are looking at maths from an early day, that they are using that as part of their industrialization of the country's programs. They could have just built tractors for agriculture. No, we're going for tanks instead. That's the route they're going on. And that philosophy carries on throughout the Second World War with deep battle. that idea of we are going to use our industrial might and the massive numbers. They may not be the most sophisticated, technologically advanced item, but we are going to have them there in such huge quantities that we will be able to make a difference in the nature of the battle. So echelon formations, etc. You know, when one lot's done, the other lot's ready, because you've got that many, you've got that millions in your population of young men, you've got that industrial output that can actually do that in that way. That's where I think, you know, in terms of their philosophy, is very different, because America's is, when a war comes, that's when we'll face up to that. We've done the experiments, we know we've got the money, we'll then do all that. The Russians are doing it right from the word go, and they're building tanks, you know, like just look at the stats on some of those vehicles they're building, T-26 that way, or BT tanks, you know, the numbers are just staggering compared to anyone else.
Now, there's usually the debate that they only have mass against quality, and I looked up a bit about the Warsaw Pact, basically, and I think O'Donnelly notes that the basic assumption from the Russians was, if there's a war, every side will face massive losses. And he made the quote, the Soviets respected the third or the first British Corps, I don't know, remember the number, and also the third US Corps, but they knew if it was gone, there was nothing to replace it. Whereas in their shock army, they had another wave. So it's more like the basic assumption of war is your quality will degrade anyway, because it will be a massive slaughter, basically, to a certain degree. Whereas they saw the strength in the elite armies, because here generally you have the steamroller argument, like, and I make the point if you're on a trench in the Second World War and the Russians attack you again and again, you see a steamroller, but this doesn't mean necessarily that you're doing human waves tactics, because it's always the problem with this discussion that sometimes it gets a bit one-sided. And I found it quite interesting to that point that no, it's not like they just build low quality. They just assume, well, quantity gets you only that far once you get punched in the face, basically, repeatedly.
Yeah, and I'd also say as well, there's another thing there, that some of these philosophies, you see, again, it's not as if they've got it right, it's the difference in the philosophies, but also, you know, when 38, 39, when Stalin's purge, 30,000 Red Army officers are killed or exiled. So Tukhachevsky's one of them. You know, this idea that, so when the Germans invade, Steve Zaloga, great line, stumbling colossus is the Red Army at that time. You know, they have enormous reserves, they have enormous amount of equipment, but it's like they've already shot the brains out. So the idea of the logistics, everyone's nervous because, you know, the very fact when the first Germans are invading, they're radioing from the front lines back to headquarters, the Red Army, and they're saying this can't be true. Our wonderful leader's done a pact with Hitler. You know, the grain trains are still going across the border the night before the Germans invade. So that idea that we don't want to believe this, or we are in a society where telling the obvious truths is not allowable. And you might argue that for the German society at the same time, but it's a complex set of things going on there. So the very fact that, again, that whole Russian doctrine, etc., stumbles enormously, but still manages to revive itself. So by 44, you're seeing it being used to enormous effect that is really still based on that Tukhachevsky's ideas earlier on that way. But that idea, and this again, you know, back to other things we've talked about, the idea that individual bit of kit works in a way that, you know, is functional, does what it's necessary for the Red Army and then later the Soviet Army wants it to. It's back to that, okay, if it does all that in the right manner, that it doesn't matter that when we take one of those vehicles in the Middle East and put it up against an M60 Patton or a variant of the Chieftain Export, that we all then go, oh, it wasn't that good, was it, sort of thing. If you're a Soviet army commander or group commander or army commander, you know, you're going, that ain't the way we're going to be using this kit. Yeah. So it's a very different set of arguments they're looking at when they're sort of saying, that's not how we're going to be using it. You know, the Egyptians are not using their T-tanks in the way that Soviet forces, Warsaw Pact, were going to be using them in that way. So that way that when we were trying to judge that, now luckily for NATO and the West, that never happened. We didn't actually have to have that final judgment call on were the Soviet forces, would that echelon, would it work? Could they cross the rivers? Did they have enough air power? Would they have dominated? Would we have had to go tactical and nuclear? All these issues, the what ifs. But that idea that they based a doctrine that they've or they did stick to, and now we're in a post-era of that sort of thing where they were going in other directions and it seems to have fallen apart for them.
Well, there's the debate if it does or not, because this is why I talked with several people on this, and you can tell, like, for instance, I think it's on tank production, I think there are tens of thousands of workers that deserted tank production facilities in the Soviet Union, which is probably unthinkable for Britain or the United States or even Germany, and they use slave labor. But did it really matter in the end? That's the question. Is it maybe the wrong or a different view on this, that everything has to be perfect? You see, like with the Germans, like they're fiddling on the tactical level, like they have mortars and then they have infantry support guns, because the infantry support gun fulfills a role that is a bit different to the mortar, but it carries out the production, but it's not that much better. Then one could argue, but maybe that makes sense for the German industry, because it were a lot of small production facilities, so it actually could have made sense. But then you have the logistical argument, you have different ammunition, maybe just standardize everything on mortars, and there's the question to be had on
what works for which country, and well, that's why different countries have different doctrines as well, because of their own, like I said earlier, and
capacities and limitations.
Absolutely. Britain being an island, we saw the RAF and the Navy as way more important and Chamberlain did that before Churchill as well. So is Chamberlain investing in Chain Home Command, the radar system, in the mid-1930s, before, when he's Prime Minister, before Churchill's in 1940. But they both follow this idea, Air Force and Navy are primary because we're an island and we have colonies and we need to exist that way. The Army is your last resort, okay? So it's either launched across as part of the British Expeditionary Force, or it's your last-ditch measure if they've managed to defeat the RAF and cross the Channel. So, so this idea is different countries are going to look at their strategic situation, their resources, the fact Britain was wealthy, we could afford to go and buy all this in. In Britain, we loved that story for decades. Plucky little Britain, unprepared, not very good at this and everything. Rubbish, we were brilliant. Churchill had been the Minister of Supply in World War I. When he's in power, these are all the guys that saw it last time. We go to a war economy straight away. Germany doesn't do that till what, 42-ish?
That's a bit problematic.
But so where's all the women in the factories in Germany?
They actually, I looked up a bit, they have quite a lot of women working. It's actually a bit complicated, but again, I talked with another military historian recently about this, and he made another point. He said, look where the Germans put the women and look where the British put the women. The British put the women into Blanchard and everything else, and the Germans put them in low quality jobs or something. But I haven't looked this up yet, so it's
well, I always go back to, maybe I'm wrong, but the Albert Speer argument, saying to Hitler, we've got to, this idea, we don't want to upset the German people or German. Actually, I think Britain was way better at going to that, we are rationing, we are doing this, we're doing all those different things earlier on, because straight away they've done it originally that way, and people like Churchill had seen that one through. But in Britain, books by people like David Edgerton and everything, they're trying to make that point that actually we like our own myth of plucky little Britain not being very good at this, when actually we were much better at it. The fact our tank production races ahead in terms of sheer numbers with Germany and within a year, these are the types of things that, again, I think are a really interesting one, because back to the thing, we're all doing it just now, we come with our myths. When you pick them apart, there's so many other juicier stories underneath, aren't there, that are really quite interesting one, I would say, for coming apart. And why do we need those national myths? Why is it in Britain we still repeat Goebbels' propaganda about how efficient and good the Nazis were? Absolute tosh.
I call this the never-ending Goebbels. Yeah. Because some people tell me, all Nazi propaganda. I said, well, Goebbels killed himself in 1945 with his wife and all his children from at least that wedding, because it was a bit had stuff on the side, so maybe some children survived. And he's still producing propaganda now. It doesn't really up. And the myths, this is also what Professor Neitzel said about the clean Wehrmacht myth. He asked the question, why was this myth placed in the first place? Or what necessity did it fulfill? And because he argues to a certain degree that it allowed to integrate a lot of veterans into German society again, into a democratic state, which otherwise probably would have not worked out that way, or might have created a civil war or something else. So there's some, of course, our job as historians is to criticize the myths, but we sometimes have to go then to the point, okay, it's a myth, we addressed it, we need to tell, and now we need to think, why was it necessary, and how can we prevent modern myths more or less? And
they're important. And national myths, I would use your phrase myth, which I was trying to work out what you were saying then, but I get it there. But I would use the phrase myth. But I with that, and they're really important as well, because they are what you believe in, and they can be hugely, not just for us to deconstruct in a haha, you're wrong there way, because they are there for reasons. Yeah. And that's another thing, is why do we need that? 55, actually, Riederlehrer Excel, the reconstruction of the German Wehrmacht, or the Bundeswehr, sorry, in 55, why do we then actually, German officers are invited back, and part of their deal with the new German government is you've got to treat veterans better, and you can't just damn us all as if we were all just Hitler lackeys, etc., whatever else that way. So, because actually NATO now needs you, and therefore you're coming on that way. And it was really interesting reading, how Veterans Association, part of the deal is why some of those different German generals who were famous in World War II go into the Bundeswehr, help reconstruct it, etc., is because of that, and how we need to have new myths that we weren't all terrible Nazis doing terrible things all the time, because actually we're going to be needed to defend a new Europe. So some of these things, how those things are constructed, I think are fascinating. Same as in Britain. So these myths we have that I've grown up with, that many modern histories are still taking apart or saying, is that really the case? We really like we like to think we are. And what a great time to be living, to see so many good histories explained in such a better manner. What no doubt that we get annoyed sometimes is it seems to be that sometimes for our own fault we slip back into an earlier myth. It's like a record, isn't it? You can't stop yourself. You suddenly find you're repeating something that actually you kind of think, actually I should know better now. Or when people are still spouting ones that you feel like, I thought we cleared that one up, but it comes back, so aren't all the German tanks better than everybody? So
I mean, most myths about the Wehrmacht I came across, except one, and I won't mention it, basically all date back to the Second World War or slightly afterwards. Nearly everything, there's one difference that is from the 21st century, which really gets me angry, so I won't talk about it. And with Speer, it's interesting because I think the research on Speer was not before, Adam Tooze was probably the first one, I think, was not really published in English. So it's still a lot of his memoirs, and Speer is very self-serving, and the whole thing with women in the labor force and everything, it's quite complicated. As again, because I was like, I looked at the data and there was like, okay, they had a lot, and then I mentioned this to the one historian, and he said, yeah, but look where they put them, and then you can see, okay, there's the one part and then the other, and there might be another layer. Then it gets complicated, and you see one thing that is definitely true, that the Nazis were very afraid of the home front, that the home front breaks again down, because they had the stab in the back myth. So they were very concerned about the home front. This to a certain degree, I think, was true, that a lot of consumer goods and other stuff was not that much rationed. But to a certain degree, this was also probably related to the fact that they thought, okay, we will defeat the Soviet Union rather fast, and then we're going back to peace. I mean, I saw, for instance, they looked at in early 1940 or late 1940, early 1941 or late 1940, they had all the artillery listed that they had. This were like, I think, 60 pieces of we use this, and the other one we completely don't use this. And then they wrote, we will use this even if we are in peace again, and we won't use this only in war until we get something better. And they also talk about table of equipment and organization for how they should be organized during peace. They have, like in German, they're called Kriegsstärke-Nachweisungen, so basically for the war, the table of organization, and the peace. And you can already see, okay, they were thinking after the fall of France, we might go back to peace now in the military. So it was not just what Nazi propaganda was. No, they were thinking, okay, this might work out, and then we go back to peace, and then we reorganize the military like we want. So and this is also why when you look in the archives, it's something very different what they thought at the time, the contemporary thinking, than what we think 20 years afterwards, because we know how everything ends.
We have the benefit of hindsight, which is part of it. Yeah, very, very true. And also looking at, we're at the moment, we talked a little bit earlier about what's going on in the Ukraine. Wouldn't it be nice that we'll be able to look back on that at some moment, but we daren't speculate on it too much at this very moment because we don't know where that world's going. And people in the future, hopefully be in a year or two's time watching this going, oh, wasn't it good that how that ended, or was won, or whatever terrible phrases we're going to come out with on that, but that battle, but that idea that we are not now sure where that's going to end up. Is the whole of Europe going to be sucked into it? You know, all these issues, which is those people were exactly the same. They don't have that benefit we have of being able to tell them where, so those guys were right and those guys were wrong. You know, we can now judge them that way, but am I going to be right or you're going to be right? You know, what for that future? That doesn't mean to say, but we're going to be damned by history at some point, you see, because of what we're speculating.
I specifically do some interviews and talked about Ukraine to a certain degree to see in a few years how right or wrong we were, or completely wrong or different. I mean, I made a video already on the ammunition crisis, because when it first came up, I was, hey, that's a classic from the First World War, from the Second World War, and then it specifically mentioned, okay, we can't really compare this war now because the numbers are huge. I mean, if you look at Ukraine, how many divisions they have, they are deployed and everything, it's like, compared to the Eastern Front in the Second World War, okay, that's a minor part of a front line, so it's not really comparable, but you see certain problems, like with the ammunition crisis in the First World War, happened for every country, I think, to a certain degree, because they were assuming a different war, and it comes back for NATO. I think it happened during the Libya crisis. They also ran out of certain
Afghanistan
ammunition
as well. America ended up having to buy ammunition from Britain in a way that and Europe, you know, it's, you're right.
And now with the Gepard, the Germans don't have ammunition for it, and the Swiss don't deliver it. So it's like...
So that's where, again, what you might call, you know, do we ever learn from history? That I would argue it's very hard to learn from history because you pick your lessons, but are there patterns in history? I would absolutely say, oh my goodness, I don't believe she's just said that, you know. So anyway, okay, so there we are again, ladies and gentlemen. I will hand you back to your host and I'll shut up.
Thank you very much and see you next time. I actually wanted you to continue.